Welcome to Rock City Cookies, where we talk about all things cookies. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Thanks for watching. Hey sweet friends, thank you so much for joining me today for a new exclusive members only full tutorial video. In our video today, we are going to be doing a shark themed birthday set. Now this set was actually for my son Gideon's 5th birthday a few months ago, so this was a really fun way to surprise my shark loving kiddo. Now before I get started, I'm going to mention here all of these cookie cutters are our own cookie cutters. So these will all be listed in our Etsy shop, which will be in the description box below. There are 6 designs in this set. We have a number 5, we have a shark tooth, a shark fin, and then we have 3 different versions of a shark. So we have a shark coming out of a wave, we have a fun shark on its side, and then we have a full body length of a shark. So let's get going on making these cookies. And as always, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and comment down below. If you have any specific themes that you would like to see me do, I'm happy to do those as well. And let's get going. So the first thing I want to talk about is the colors that I used in this set. So again, I will link them down below, but I used a red, which is called Super Red. I use the Hobby Lobby colors, the Sunny Side Up colors. So if you do not have a Hobby Lobby close to you, I did link the AmeriColors in the description box below. I have no preference over one over the other. I think AmeriColor is a great product. I just personally have a Hobby Lobby just right down the street, and it's cheaper just to go there and buy the colors directly. So that is why I do that, just for the convenience, and I don't have to worry about shipping. That is why I choose Hobby Lobby over AmeriColor. However, there are lots of color options out there for you, and I definitely can't say I recommend one over the other. I think they're both great products. So this in both Hobby Lobby Sunny Side Up and AmeriColor is called Super Red. And then I used, for the blue, I used Royal Blue, and you're gonna have to, if you have to start from a white, you are gonna have to use a lot of drops for pretty much all of these colors, for the red, the black, and the dark blue. You are going to have to use a lot of food coloring to get it to that color. However, as you know, I like to freeze my leftover icing, and so I don't start my icing fresh typically. I usually start from a existing color, which helps to get those colors a lot faster that you need, because you're not having to start your icing all the way from white. So if you have a pink, if you have leftover red, make sure you use that first before you start from white. That's what I did for the red, the black, and the dark blue. I started from existing blues, existing reds, existing grays or black colors. So don't worry about having an exact match to mine. I'm just telling you what I used for this set, because blue is my son's favorite color. So I definitely wanted to make sure that I had blue sharks. I used Super Red for the red color. I used Royal Blue to get the dark blue. I used teal for the lighter bluish green color. Obviously, I used Super Black for the black, and that is the one brand I prefer AmeriColor from actual Hobby Lobby's black. I feel like AmeriColor black is so much better than Hobby Lobby's black. I can use a significantly less amount of the AmeriColor black to get a dark rich black than I can with the Hobby Lobby black. For the gray color, you use just a tiny bit of black. So I typically, if I'm looking to get a gray, I'm going to use a toothpick. I'm going to insert the toothpick into my black food color bottle, and then I'm going to use that toothpick and stick it into my bowl of icing, stir it up, and continue that process until I have a gray. If you squeeze black directly into your white icing, you may get way too dark too fast. So if you do the toothpick method and you transfer over food gel on a toothpick into your icing, that's the best way when you're trying to get a subtle color. And then of course I have white, which was just freshly made white icing. So that was my color palette for this set. I will link all of the food gel color down below so that you don't have to write that down. You can just click on those links. The first cookie we're going to do today is the number 5 cookie. Now this design can be repeated on any other number. So it doesn't have to be a 5th birthday. You can do this for any other cookie of any other birthday. But of course my son was turning 5, so that is why I chose the number 5 cookie cutter. First, I'm going to project my number 5 on onto my cookie. Obviously, you don't necessarily have to do this with the 5 outline. You can pretty well see where your icing needs to go, but I like consistency. So for me, if I can project something and have that consistency where all of my 5s look the same, I'm gonna do that. I'm going to outline first with the projected 5 onto my cookie. Then I will turn off the projector and then I will flood my cookie. Now, all of my flood icing, and I do this immediately. I get asked that a lot. I get asked, do you outline and then let that dry and then flood? And the answer is no, I do not. I outline, put that bag down, I immediately pick up my flood icing, and then I flood my cookie. So it's 2 different bags of icing, a thick icing and a thinner icing, but I do both of them right after each other. So even though that thick icing for the outline icing, even though it's a wet icing still, it hasn't dried, it's thick enough that it still contains your thinner icing without it spilling over the edge, even though you're doing it right away. So do not be afraid to outline and flood immediately. It will hold its shape as long as your flood icing is not too thin. After I have flooded my icing, I did use a little bit of a thicker icing for my flood icing on this entire set. So I have to use my scribe to smooth out my icing for every single cookie in the set, which a thick icing is going to give you a little bit more of a puff. I do like using a thicker flood icing because my cookies don't lay so flat. They kind of look puffed up and it kind of gives them some depth, and I think that looks really cool. It looks better. However, it is a little bit more time consuming when you have to smooth out your icing all the way around, like I'm having to do for every single cookie. But my icing wasn't too thick that my flood didn't smooth out. So there's definitely a balance there that takes a lot of practice to figure out. But as long as you can smooth out your icing and it not leave bumps or it not show where your scribe tool is, to me, that is the perfect flood consistency. Now I'm going to add my wave onto this dried cookie. So again, my cookies go onto a cookie tray and they have a fan standing right in front of them. And that fan rotates back and forth and it's constantly blowing. It's a tower fan. It is blowing on those cookies for several hours before I then move on to decorate on top of my cookie. Most of the time, I try to bake my cookies and do the icing in the morning, and immediately after I have my icing colored and my cookies baked, I will bring them to my cookie room, and then I will try to do the base flood for all of my cookies. I try to have all of that done by lunchtime. Then I take a break for lunch, I take care of my kiddos, we do whatever we need to do, and then by 2 o'clock, I'm typically back in my cookie room working on the detail work for my cookies. So between that lunchtime break and 2 o'clock, it's about 2 or 3 hours that my cookies have sat in front of a fan and are drying. Because my cookies have been drying for 2 or 3 hours, they are dry enough that at that point I can do any detail work on top of the cookie that I need to do and not worry about it puncturing through my icing. So I took my thick blue icing that I'm using to outline in other areas on these cookies. I took my thick blue icing and I outlined a wave onto my number. And again, you can repeat this design. It doesn't matter what birthday number it is. You can put a wave on any number. So I outlined and then I took my paintbrush that I use specifically for cookies only. How did you open the door? My cat just opened my office door. I don't even know how he did that. I then took a paintbrush that I used for cookies only, and I spread out the wave, the icing, and made it look like a curve of a wave using that paintbrush and thick icing. I put the cookie back under the fan and then I let it dry. But this time, because it was a thick icing dries faster than thinner icing. And 2, because it's not very much, it's a really thin amount of icing, it dried pretty quickly. So I was able to move on to the next color, which was my teal color. And I was able to do the same process, but not near as much icing. So just a squiggle, just a little bit of icing with the teal icing. Using a food safe paintbrush, I then pressed down all over and I spread out that icing, and then I did the same process. I put it back under the fan, let it dry for a few minutes. After the teal has dried, I'm going to do the same process again, but I'm going to do it with white. And this time I'm gonna add a little bit more white than I did with the teal, because I'm gonna pretty much cover the majority of the wave with that white, which kind of mimics like the foam of a wave, the foam of the ocean. And that is really all it takes to complete this cookie. It is really not difficult to have this wave look. You can do it on a birthday number. You can do it just on any shape at all in any set that you're doing. It doesn't have to be sharks. It can be any ocean theme. You can do, or beach theme. You can do a wave very simply by just doing these 3 tones and using a paintbrush. All right, so our number 5 cookie is complete. We are going to move on to the next cookie, which is the full shark. So this is when you look at the shark, it's his full body. So that's why I'm calling it the full shark. But again, all of these cookie cutters are on our website, but we are going to start with his mouth first, because I need his mouth to be the very backdrop of this cookie. So when you are thinking about doing any cookie, it doesn't have to be a shark, it can be any animal or really any cookie. You have to think about it in layers. So what do you want to be the very back and kind of build up? So when you are decorating a cookie, you have to think about what is the thing that's under every other layer. So a lot of times that's going to be your flood, right? You're going to most of the time have that be your flood. But when you're doing other designs like characters or animals or anything like that, you may not have that be your first layer. Your first layer may need to actually be something on the cookie, or it may need to be specific areas of your cookie. So for our shark, the first thing that we're gonna do that needs to be the very bottom layer of your cookie is its mouth. And then we're gonna do its eyes. And I always do this for pretty much any character or animal, person, anything that has an eye. I'm going to do that first or second. It's going to be one of the very first things I do for my cookie when I have to do an eye. I really feel like it makes a big difference when you decorate an eye first and then you decorate around the eye. I don't know why, but it just works when you do it this way. So you are going to do the red of the mouth and then you're going to decorate his eye. So his eye is just going to be a white blob of relatively thick icing. Again, it needs to be able to smooth out if with a wiggle of a scribe, but you want this to be thick, because if it's a thin icing, it will collapse. Trust me, I have had it happen many times. So you definitely want to make sure that when you're doing eyes that you use thick icing. So you're going to do the white first. And again, I'm going to recommend this as well. When you are doing an eyeball, it needs to be bigger than the actual size you want it to be, because you are going to be flooding around it. So you are going to lose a little bit of the width of the eyeball when the flood covers it. So make sure that if you're projecting an image, you actually put icing on your cookie larger than the circle that's in the image, because by the time that you add the flood icing around it, then it shrinks down to about the size that you wanted it to be to begin with. Now don't go crazy and have a really huge eye, but definitely put more icing there than you think that you need. So after you do the white of the eye, then you're going to add black icing on top. Again, it needs to be a thicker icing. Use your scribe tool, kind of smooth it out, and then you're going to do a little white dot on top of the eye just to give your eye a little bit of shine and personality, that signature cartoon look. After I have done the eye, I'm still able to keep working on this cookie because I don't have any sections touching right now. So as long as you don't have your sections touching, you can keep adding to your cookie. So I'm still have the same cookie on my turntable and I'm adding the gray area to our shark. From here on, I'm gonna have to let that dry because the rest of the shark will be touching other icing. So you have to let it dry after that amount of work, but we were able to do quite a few sections before we had to stop working. Again, this is a small section of icing. It's not going to take as much drying time before you can work on the next section. So this probably really only had to dry for about an hour under a fan before I was able to work on the next section without having to worry about my icing cracking when I picked up the cookie. And if you don't know what I'm talking about with cracked icing, so if you move a cookie too quickly and the icing hasn't dried far enough in to keep it stabilized, you can actually crack your icing. Sometimes it's okay, and by the time it dries, like fully dries, you can barely tell, but a lot of times you can still see like a hairline crack in your icing. So definitely make sure that your icing dries enough before you pick it up and touch it again to prevent any cracking. But I obviously had let this one dry for a little while under the fan, and I added the blue to my shark as well as his little tongue and his mouth. I am using my scribe scribe tool to smooth out all of these sections because again, I'm using a little bit of a thicker icing, so I'm having to help my icing along to smooth out. You can also pick up your cookie and shake it a little bit, and that will help smooth it out. But thankfully, I didn't have to do that with any of these. I was able to just use my scribe tool to smooth out the icing. When the blue icing is still wet, we're gonna add a little bit more detail to our shark. We're gonna add some gills as well as just some spots, which in nature, sharks, actually a lot of them are spotted. So I kind of wanted to add that, and it gives our shark a little bit more detail and interest. So we're gonna add more details on top of our shark in a minute, but to start, we're gonna give him a background with a wet on wet technique. That's what that's called when you do a different color icing on already wet icing. It's called wet on wet. So that's what we're doing here with our shark. Now I did mess up a little bit. I got a dot a little bit too big. So I just went back with blue icing and I covered up a little bit of the gray, and so it looked fine in the end. Now let's add some teeth to our shark. You can't have a shark without having shark teeth. So we're gonna add just a thick white icing with just a little bit of blob. So you'll squeeze out icing, you'll touch the mouth, and then as you stop squeezing the bag, just pull your icing out and it'll give you that little triangle look, which is perfect for teeth. I did give our little shark a nose too. I forgot to mention that. I did give him a little gray nose on top of the gray area of the shark. I did let that icing dry for quite a while, and now I'm going to add the final details to our shark, which is just, we did the wet on wet, so it was a flush gray dots and gray gills on our shark. But now I'm going to add a little bit of texture by raising some of those same areas. So I'm just going to add a dot on his back randomly throughout each of the bunches. And then I'm going to also add a little bit more lines to his gills so that it adds that extra little snap of detail. And that's it. Our full shark cookie is done. And it was multiple layers. It had several steps, but none of them were very complicated. So as long as you take your time, you're able to execute a cookie that has a lot of steps pretty easily. Now let's move on to the shark fin cookie. So this is going to just be a shark fin that has some splashes of waves coming out. So this shark fin is coming out of the water, which is definitely something that we are all fearful of seeing when we're in the water. But you are going to outline this cookie in our gray color, and then you are just going to fill it in with the flood icing. And I'm sorry, I keep looking down. I'm watching the video of me decorating as I'm talking to you, so it's hard to make sure I'm keeping my eye line going back and forth and keeping up with what I'm doing in the video. But you will use your scribe tool to smooth out that icing, being careful not to push it too far over the side so that your icing doesn't spill over the edge. And now I am using a dot of icing with a palette knife. So I will have these palette knives linked in the description box below. I use these a lot in a lot of sets. It's a relatively inexpensive cost to purchase this set, and you are able to use it for just so many things. So I highly recommend, if you don't have palette knives, that you get you some. So I did a dot of blue icing 4 different ways, and then I took my palette knife, I pressed into the dot of icing, and you pull down. If you have a wipe or a paper towel next to you, I typically wipe off the palette knife and then I repeat the process. So I did it 4 times. Well, for the blue color, I did it 4 times. I let that blue section dry, and then I came back with the teal and I repeated the process with only 3 little waves that time to kind of add that 4 to 3. So it's not identical amount. It's just kind of that design element where you're kind of shrinking down. And then I added the white icing at the bottom. The same process I used with the number 5 with the ocean wave on it. You're going to use a paintbrush and you are going to dab at that white icing and have it be all at the bottom, but then also on the top of each wave. And that is really it. This was a super simple cookie. So that is our shark fin coming up out of the water. Moving on to our shark tooth. And I have to be honest with you, this was probably my least favorite design in this set. And if I could go back and do it over, I probably would do it differently. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it ended up being an okay cookie, but there were a few things that I would do differently. And one of them would be that I would probably definitely get a little bit of dust, so like petal dust, and I probably would have dirtied up his tooth just a little bit. I kind of felt like the white of his tooth was too white, and it kind of took away from the set, whereas if you had just a little bit like a light brown petal dust or just some sort of aging to his tooth, because we know that his teeth aren't going to be, a shark's tooth isn't going to be that white. So I do wish I would have added, after the cookie had dried completely, gone back with some petal dust, a really light brown probably, or like a tan color, and just kind of aged his tooth on the outside of his tooth and just dusted that petal dust around just to kind of add a little bit more interest to this cookie. I did end up doing the red that's in the set for the gum part of his tooth, and clearly I smoothed that out with my scribe tool. But now I'm to the second part of this cookie that I do not like, which is the font and the consistency of my lettering here. I don't like to use a thin icing for the lettering because I don't like to have it look sloppy, and I feel like this looks sloppy. If it would have been a thicker icing and a thinner font, I think I would have liked this a lot better, or more of a whimsy font. I don't know. There's just something about the combination of the icing I used and the font I used that I just don't like, in addition to the tooth being too white. So if I could do this again, I would definitely redo this. Now, the reason why my font was on the thin side was because this font, this teal and this blue, is what I'm using on the waves when I'm using the palette knife and I'm pushing down. And so I had already cut those bags. When I did this, I had already cut those bags because I don't use piping tips. I just cut my piping bags, and I'd already cut the hole bigger so that I could do those dots of icing for the palette knife, which meant that in order for me to have more consistent writing, I would have had to rebag icing and cut a smaller hole and then do better writing. I should have done it. To be really honest with you, I was being lazy and I paid the price because I didn't like the end product. So I highly recommend finding a more whimsical font, using a thicker icing with a smaller piping tip so that you're able to get that consistency. Don't make my mistake. All right, but our shark tooth cookie is done. We have moved on to the shark wave cookie, and I call it the shark wave because it looks like he's coming out of the wave. The first thing that you need to do is his mouth. Again, we're thinking about layers. When we think about these cookies, we think about layers. What needs to be the very back thing? Well, the very back thing needs to be the back of his mouth with his mouth open, because we're going to be adding teeth and all of that. So we need to have a background for his mouth, which of course was going to be red. So with your thick icing and with your paintbrush, you're going to spread out red icing. I do project the image onto the cookie so that I can make sure that I have the red icing exactly where it needs to go. And I typically do that no matter what the design is. When I'm spreading out icing, I'm going to go ahead and project my image there just so that I can make sure to have that whole area covered. And then I move on to his eyes once again. So the thick white icing, the black, and then the little dot of white on the pupil. In thinking about layers, I knew I wanted some waves in front of the shark, and I knew I wanted some waves behind the shark. So it looks like he is surrounded by water. So in order to accomplish that, you have to think about what needs to go behind the shark. Well, I needed some waves to go behind the shark, so I need to make sure I do that section of the cookie first. So I added my blue dots of icing, and I'm using my palette knife. I'm just pressing into that blob of icing and I'm pulling down. I'm going to let all of those dry first, and then we will come back and add the next layer, which will be our shark. But really, the waves are super simple technique that you are able to repeat not only with a shark design, but really any design. Once those waves, the blue waves, have dried, let's go ahead. You're going to want to finish out the shark. And again, all of these sharks have multiple steps. It's just a part of this design. But because of the simplicity of all of these steps, it really didn't take me just a whole lot of extra time. I was able to finish them pretty easily within one day, which I don't know if I've mentioned this. I think I've mentioned this in the past, but I prefer, when I'm doing cookies, I prefer to do it a whole set in one day if I can. So that means that I wake up, I bake my cookies, I color my icing, I flood them, and then I decorate them, and I finish up all the detail work. I try to do that all in the same day. And that is just how I prefer my workflow to go. Other people like to do all of their orders spread out throughout the week. So it's really just a matter of finding what works for you. But for me, I like to have it all done at one time so that I can move on to the next set and really focus my creative energy on that instead of having it being divided amongst all the sets. But I know a lot of creators who bake all of their cookies on one day and maybe do their icing that same day. And then they flood all their cookies the next day. And then they do all the detail work for their cookies the following day or following 2 days. So it just really depends on what works for you. But anyway, so that's what I typically do. In this set, I was done pretty early into my day. It's a really great day if I can be done by dinner. But if I can't remember if I had these done by dinner, but if not after dinner, I had them done pretty quickly. Anyway, if I don't have to work till like midnight when I'm doing a set, it's an easy set. So I definitely did not work into the night with this cookie set, and it was a 2 dozen. I did 2 dozen of these. Now that I have done the gray portion of his face and I let that dry, now it's time to do the outside of our shark, the blue portion of our shark. So you are going to want to make sure again that you outline it with the thick icing, otherwise it could overflow onto the out of your cookie. Outline and then flood. This is a small area of icing, so you're going to want to make sure that you really look for any air bubbles. This is why I really like to have a thicker flood icing, because even though this is still your flood and you typically don't have craters in your actual flood part of your cookie, because this cookie is divided into so many sections and this outside part is not a very thick part, it kind of acts the same way as when you're doing detail work on top, and you can have craters in these areas. So make sure you're using a thicker icing, but also look for air bubbles. Look to make sure that your cookie has all the air bubbles out, that it's all nice and smooth, and hopefully you won't have any craters in your outside area of this shark. Okay, once that has dried, so again, this is step after step. You do a step, you dry it, you do a step, you dry it. So that in itself can be time consuming. But after the shark itself has dried, now we are going to add the waves in front of the shark. So again, we're trying to make it look like the shark is coming out of the water and he has waves surrounding him. So at this point, that's when I'm going to use my little teal color for the waves. Same process, do a glob of icing, and then you're going to pull down. Now, honestly, the teal was just a little bit on the thin side for this process. It probably could have stood to be a little bit thicker so that it held its shape a little bit more and it didn't run into the other waves that were next to it. After the teal has dried, we need to add that like white sea foam to our waves. So you're going to do the same process as we have done before. You're going to add the thick white icing to the bottom of your cookie. Use that paintbrush, dab out the white icing, and add a little bit of white to each one of the waves. But we aren't finished with our little shark yet. We have to add his teeth. Same process. So when you add teeth and you want that sharp, like triangle look, you are going to squeeze out your icing while you're touching the area that you want it to stick to. So while you're touching his mouth, squeeze out the icing, touch your icing bag to his mouth, and as you pull away, you stop squeezing the bag. So that is what creates the little triangle look. So squeeze and squeeze as you pull. So you're going squeeze and then out, and then squeeze and then out the whole time as you're piping around. You need this to be a thick icing. Don't forget, your teeth need to be a thick icing, not like break your hand thick, but pretty thick to keep its shape. You're going to do one layer all the way around, and then you're going to come back and do a second layer because sharks have multiple layers of teeth. So you want his whole mouth to look full of teeth. So you're going to do it once, and because this is a thick icing, I don't have to worry about the icing running into each other. I'm able to go right around right away and finish out those teeth with a second layer, and each tooth will hold its shape. All right, that is our shark wave cookie. He is completed, and we're able to move on to the next design. The next design we're going to do is the side view of our shark. So he's a happy little shark, but it's like his side view of him. So I called him our side shark. Once again, you're going to do the mouth first. So swiggle some red icing, some thick red icing, and then you'll just get a paintbrush and smooth out that icing with the paintbrush where his mouth will be. Now, I'm not too picky on the icing I use when I'm like smoothing out a background like that. I've used really thin icing. The only difference with using a thicker icing is just that it covers better. Sometimes when you use a thin icing, it's a little bit too thin and you can still see the cookie underneath. So that's why I prefer to use a thicker icing when I'm doing a process like that. But in a pinch, I have used a thin icing and it works. You just might have to use 2 layers of it. After the mouth, then we move on to the eye, just like before with all of our other sharks. I feel like I'm a little bit of a broken record, but you're going to do the white and then you'll do the black and then you'll do the little dot of white icing. In other tutorials, I've mentioned this, but with that little dot of white, if you don't want to actually touch your icing bag to the eye, sometimes what I do is I take my icing and I take my scribe tool and I do a little bitty dot out of the bag, and then I take my scribe tool and I touch the dot, and then I put the dot from my scribe tool onto the eye itself. And that works great. I use that a lot of times. However, my icing was fine enough to be able to touch directly to the eye, but a lot of times I will do that technique where I squeeze out a little bit of icing from my icing bag. I use my scribe tool, I grab that icing, and then I put that icing directly onto the spot that I need it to be. Just like before, we're going to do the gray section of our shark first, and then we will add the blue part of our shark. So first off, you'll need to project your image if you have a projector, and just to get that consistency. These cookies you can pretty well do without a projector if you just want to buy the cookie cutter and look at the image while you're working. However, the projector for me was one of my very first, no, it was not. That's a big fat lie. It was not one of my very first purchases. I didn't purchase a projector until I had been doing cookies for a year. But I will have to say the projector was my best cookie purchase. My best investment for my business was my projector, and I wish I would have gotten it sooner. So if you do not have a projector, I highly recommend you save up the money. All in all, I spent probably about $200 on my projector, because you have to get the projector and then you have to also get all the cords that go with it, and I had to get like something to hold my projector on top of my table. So I plan on doing a video that kind of shows you exactly how I use a projector and like what all that looks like for me. All in all, by the time I bought all of that stuff, it was about $200. So it is an investment for sure, especially when you're starting your business and you don't have that kind of profit yet. So it definitely took me a little while to make that jump, but man, when I finally bought my projector, oh, it made all the difference in the world, and my skill level shot through the roof. Like it was an immediate change. So if you can get a projector, I highly recommend it. But anyway, so that is what I do, is I project my image. Even if it looks like a relatively easy image or an easy design, I still like to project it, just because it does add that consistency in your set where you're looking at every cookie looks almost the same. That does add a level of professionalism that I think is really important. However, if you don't have a projector, I feel like these sharks are simple enough that you can do them without. Okay, so after we added our blue, we're doing that wet on wet technique with our gray again. So I'm just adding some gills and some little dots onto our shark while my blue icing is still wet. And this gray that I'm using is the same consistency that I outlined the gray section of my shark cookie. So it's the thicker gray that you see me outline with before I fled. Don't forget to add a little nose for him, and then of course his red tongue, and then his teeth. And once again, I do one layer of teeth, and then I come back and I do the second layer on top of that. And I don't worry about the drying time in between, because the icing is so thick that every tooth will hold its shape even when it is right on top of each other. So the first layer I kind of try to do inside his mouth, and then the second layer of teeth I kind of do right on the edge, right on the outside of his lip, so that it kind of adds that depth where you can see some of the teeth are inside and some of the teeth are outside. And I go in between each tooth with the icing. So I try to leave space, and then on the second layer around, then I try to go in between where the space was for the second layer of teeth. To finish up our shark, we need to add the dots on top of the dried blue icing and add the extra part of his gills just to give him a little bit more dimension and detail. And that's it. We are done with our whole set of our themed cookies for a shark birthday. If you have any questions, please let me know in the description box below. I hope that this was an enjoyable tutorial for you and that, of course, that you learned something. And as always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. You're my favorites. Bye.